Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Dorothy Noyes. I'm the director of the Mershon Center for International Studies, and happy to welcome you here to the presentation of the Edgar S. Furniss Jr. Book Award. This award commemorates the founding director of the Mershon Center, and it's conferred annually on a first book that makes an exceptional contribution to the study of international, national, or human security. The Furniss Committee has a pretty good track record in recognizing talent because among the awardees have been John Mearsheimer, Barry Posen, Stephen Walt, Audie Klotz, Jacques Hymans, Michael Horowitz, Karen Yari-Milo, Jesse Driscoll, Aisha Ahmad, Jay Lyle, and quite a few others, and most recently Adam Lerner for the 2022 award. Today we are taking a leap back in time to present the award for 2021, and the reason for this has not to do only with the pandemic, but with the fact that by 2022, our winner was rather busy on the National Security Council. The committee thus demonstrated its good judgment once more in selecting Rush Doshi's The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order. The Long Game is published by Oxford University Press. The Furniss Committee is made up of distinguished senior scholars from multiple disciplines. It is chaired by the historian Jeffrey Parker, joined by Laura Dugan from sociology, narrative scholar and folklorist Amy Schumann, and Alexander Thompson from international relations. And here's what they had to say about their choice for 2021. Doshi takes on an important question. What are China's strategic ambitions? Doshi brings impressive new evidence to bear, derived from collections of original documents in several languages. He argues for the concept of a grand strategy and identifies three forms of control: coercive capability, consensual inducements, and legitimacy that unfold over carefully defined phases of blunting, building, and expansion. The book is empirically rich and also strong conceptually and theoretically, addressing broader questions about hegemony and power shifts. The mixture of academic rigor and policy relevance is appropriate for both Mershon and the Furniss Award. This mixture of rigor and relevance has gotten Doshi through some important doors since he completed his 2019 PhD at Harvard, where he studied with Ohio State PhD Joshua Kurtzer, among others. To mention only a few of those doors, he's been a fellow at the Brookings Institution and the Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center, and he served from 2021 to 2024 as the Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan on the National Security Council. And on the Council, he coordinated U.S. government policy on China and Taiwan, drafted the administration's China strategy, staffed key summits between the President and national security advisors and their PRC counterparts, and he was the lead action officer for the negotiations that launched AUKUS, which is the trilateral security partnership between Australia, the UK, and the US. Currently, he is not quite relaxing, but he is an assistant professor in the Security Studies program at Georgetown, as well as the CV Star Senior Fellow for Asia Studies and Director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations. He is an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve, and in his spare time, he has a new daughter. And along with Foreign Affairs, the Washington Quarterly, and pretty much everywhere else that U.S. foreign policy is debated, you have probably seen him recently in the New York Times. So with all that, we're extremely grateful that he has been able to make time for us here and have meetings today with our students and faculty. And so, if I may bring you up to receive the objet, Rush Doshi, we are delighted to present you with the Edgar S. Furniss Book Award for
2021.
2020. That was my childhood street address for 2020. For 2021. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming.
I can hold it for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dorothy. That was an incredibly kind and gracious introduction, and I'm very generous, very grateful for it. I have a chance now to kind of prove that the book was actually worth all the kind words and praise. So this is my chance, and if you don't think I met the bar, then you can let the committee know, but also you can let me know in question and answer. So grateful to be with all of you. Let me go ahead and start by saying that the book project was prompted by a simple set of questions. Does China have a grand strategy? And if it does, how would we know? There was a debate on this question over the last decade. That's part of why I wanted to write the book, because I thought it would be interesting to impact that debate. And to do that, I compiled an original sort of database, 5 million words long, of sort of leaked and public Chinese Communist Party material. It took me several years to assemble it. I took a detailed look as well inside China's national security institutions. And I tried to conduct a rigorous review of China's military, economic, and political decisions. And I'll walk you through all that evidence. My basic finding was that since the end of the Cold War, China's grand strategy has been profoundly shaped by its perceptions of U.S. power and threat. So in the 1990s, the United States and China had a sort of quasi-alliance, in the 1980s, against the Soviet Union. But after the trifecta of Tiananmen Square, the Gulf War, and the Soviet collapse, that era of Cold War cooperation sort of came to an early end. And China began to see the United States as a threat and pursued what I call a blunting strategy, essentially designed to undermine American military, economic, and political leverage over China in a non-assertive fashion. This strategy continued until 2008, when we had the global financial crisis, and that caused China to pursue a building strategy, which is a strategy that lays the foundation for Chinese order building within Asia. China felt confident enough to pursue that. And that is had continued all the way until essentially 2016, where there's a US political shock and later the COVID pandemic and a number of other issues that lead China to think the US is really in hurtling decline. That leads it to kind of take the building approach and make it global, and that's a strategy of global expansion. Now these are the claims that the book makes. I'll walk you through in just a moment the evidence, but before I do, I wanted to set some definitions, and I'll be a little bit academic here, and I hope those of you who are not as academically inclined will forgive me for this portion of the presentation. But the first question I think we have to ask is sort of, why bother doing any of this at all? And the reason I did is I wanted to make a contribution to grand strategy. How do we study it in a way that is not just arbitrary, but what I would call social scientific or quasi-scientific in a rigorous way? Second question was about order building. How is it that rising powers build order? Specifically, what role do economic, not just military tools, play in building order? Now, when we think about building order, we often think about it in terms of the U.S. and what it did after World War II. But how does a rising power achieve it when it doesn't have hegemony? And then there was a third kind of question. What causes these countries, rising powers, to change their grand strategic approach over time? That's something worth explaining. So I also wanted to solve a number of empirical questions about China's behavior that were puzzling to me and to others, and that had been written about for decades. One is on the military side. Why did China avoid investments in the kinds of power projection and amphibious capabilities that would allow it to take Taiwan? And then why did it suddenly reverse course and decide, okay, now is the time to invest there? Politically, why did it join regional institutions like APEC or ASEAN Regional Forum and then stall them? Why join something to stall it? And then why did it later create its own redundant institutions after the fact? And economically, why did China care so much about its trade terms with the United States, what's called most favored nation status, in the 1990s, but not care about it in the 1980s when it was voted on every year in Congress? And then why did they offer trade and investment terms to other countries that are really concessionary? They're almost too generous. What explains that? So those are some of the empirical puzzles that motivate the project, and they all tie to grand strategy. But before I get too far down the road, here's a roadmap. The first question that we'll focus on is, what is grand strategy? The second is, how do we know if China has one? That's the methodology. The third is, what are the grand strategies of rising powers? And then finally, I'll talk to you through the argument that I make here, which is going to be much more focused on what China has done and what it has thought. So, what is grand strategy? This is a very slippery term. There are a lot of different definitions. I was talking with some of you about this a moment ago. And actually in a draft journal article, I'll probably try to undertake a deeper analysis of the concept, drawing from social science. But to pin it down is something we have to do for this book to make any sense. And I think if you assume that strategy is a combination of ends, ways, and means, then competing definitions can sort of be reduced to the scope of each of those terms. So some say that grand strategy is the use of military tools to achieve political goals, like, let's say, people like Barry Posen, Robert Hart, and others. But I think in actuality, that's really not any different from military strategy. Some define grand strategy not narrowly, but expansively. They say it's the use of any tool, any means to achieve any end. And I think this approach is no different from the word strategy. So what do we mean by grand strategy? Otherwise, what's the point of the term? I think a better definition, and one drawn from history, would have to be unique from other terms. It'd have to reflect the prevailing usage in most fields and reflect the historical evolution of the concept. By the way, the term grand strategy emerged from the Napoleonic era, primarily, when it was a synonym for Napoleonic generalship. But then it evolved over time. Through the age of steamships and into the total wars of the 20th century, there was a consistent trend in what we meant by grand strategy. It ultimately meant, actually the definition of it expanded with the capabilities of the modern state. So we are now at a point where I think the ends of grand strategy have always remained fixed in security, sovereignty, safety, territorial integrity, maybe your power position. But the means that are used in grand strategy have widened over time to include military, economic, and political tools. And that, again, is sort of a historical evolution of the concept. So I argue that grand strategy is an integrated security theory. What makes it, basically, it's the use of a wide-ranging number of means to accomplish security-related ends. And here's why this matters. What makes grand strategy grand isn't just the end goal, something like security. That's a big thing. But it's the fact that so many means of statecraft are coordinated together to achieve it. That's a really hard thing to do. That kind of coordination and focus and long-term effort in a grand strategy acts as a force multiplier. It allows a state to punch above its weight. And with China, you already have a heavyweight. And if you combine its $17 or $18 trillion economy with its modernizing military, its diplomatic reach, its economic and technological capability, that means if it has a grand strategy, that has big implications for the world and for the United States. And that leads to a second question. If China had a grand strategy, how would we know? Because the core analytic exercise we face in answering this question is actually not that new at all. And in my course at Georgetown, we began the lecture, or that series of lectures, with a discussion of this very question in historical context. Really, established powers have tried to answer this for a very long time. And Great Britain faced this question about a century ago when the British diplomat Crowe wrote a landmark memorandum surveying the wide-ranging and disparate behavior of a rising Germany, and he basically asked the question of whether it had a grand strategy. And he had two explanations, or as he put it, quote, the choice must lie between two hypotheses. And one was that it had what he called a, quote, vague, confused, and unpractical statesmanship due to the distractions, you could say, of bureaucratic politics or factional politics or nationalist pressures. It just didn't act in a coordinated way. The second explanation was that maybe it had what he called a conscious design scheme, or what we could call a grand strategy, rooted fundamentally in its relative position as weaker but rising at Great Britain, and that it was essentially aimed at establishing some kind of German hegemony in Europe. And regardless of the memorandum's ultimate accuracy, the exercise is the same that we face in many ways today. And what's uncanny about his memorandum is I think it echoes the debate that exists in China studies between those who believe there is a grand strategy and those who believe that there is not. So that's why nothing is new, including this question. So how do we find it? Well, drawing from this approach, in fact, that Crowe used, I argue that you can understand a country's grand strategy by looking at for three things. The first is grand strategic capability. We find these in national security institutions. What does this mean? Does a state have the ability to coordinate multiple means of statecraft and overcome parochial vested interests to pursue national interests? That's what we mean by capability. Institutions. The second question. Do we see grand strategic concepts? Are the ends, the ways, the means of grand strategy visible in authoritative texts? And for this, we look at Chinese Communist Party texts in particular. And finally, we need to see grand strategic conduct. Does China's political, military, and economic behavior match what is laid out broadly in those texts? We have to focus on all three, because otherwise the strategy wouldn't be grand. It would just be one facet of strategy. So when you put all this together, it yields the following 10 questions on the slide. These questions help us figure out not just whether strategy exists, but the content of that strategy. So here's the first three. And I'm going to walk you through them very quickly. So the first question is sort of about these concepts. Does China have a grand strategy? Well, we want to answer whether we can find the ends, the ways, the means in the key text. Does it have the capability? We look at the institutions. Can it coordinate multiple instruments of statecraft, your different departments and ministries and agencies? Can it overcome national vested interests? And then the capability. Do we see variation within the behavior of China that's consistent with grand strategy, both across time, across the various instruments of statecraft? Let me put it this way. If they're taking some kind of military action consistent with grand strategy, are they also taking an economic and political action at the same rough time period? So to do this work, I essentially built out this database of texts that I had bought in China and had digitized in the United States. Everything from sort of the key party Congress documents to major internal foreign policy addresses and the memoirs of top officials, CMC vice chairmen, state councilors, general secretaries, anything you could find, I basically tried to get my hands on it. And so with respect to text, you can kind of create a hierarchy of texts, which helps you understand which ones are important and which ones aren't. And that helps you resolve conflicts between the texts. Like a text from the core leader, Xi Jinping, might matter a lot more than a text from some bureaucrat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So you have to have this hierarchy of what you're reading. This database doesn't include everything in the world. It's curated. And there's kind of an inclusion rule about what goes into the database. And leadership documents go in, regularly published party documents that are compendiums go in. These are used essentially to govern China. So that's why they go in there. And that brings me essentially to this kind of broad point here, which is that these documents are organized in a hierarchical way. Within them, there is a party line, or luxian. There's the guideline, or fangzhen, and there's the policy, the zhengce. And these things have value in steering the ship of state. So we look for these in the text to get a sense, hey, what are they thinking? Is there a strategy here? And just a fun quote here. This is a Chinese leader in 2003 saying, "It is necessary in any and all circumstances to be unwavering in implementing the central government's line, guidelines, policies, and work." So don't deviate. And every single Chinese leader has made this point about foreign policy. American presidents might try to make the point, but they're very unsuccessful, I think, in generally having their way across the bureaucracy. So having described this, and by the way, these are some of the sources that the book draws from: leader speeches, foreign policy documents, party media on party judgments, think tank commentary, and this is the hierarchy of what counts and what doesn't count, and it's more of the sources. So I want to turn now to this question of Chinese conduct. So great powers undertake a lot of different behaviors. It's not always possible to separate signal and noise and determine what is strategically motivated and what is not. And given this challenge, a kind of rigorous or social scientific approach can help. And I looked at military, economic, and political behavior. And in each of those, there were identifiable puzzles, as I mentioned earlier, that are worth exploring. And there are key observables in each of those that you can kind of use to basically get traction on the analytical question: does China have a grand strategy? And you also look for synchronized shifts within each of these policy domains. So I've got the military, the political, the economic. I've got the puzzles up there, and how we try to explain them. And in the end, I think the best explanation for a lot of these puzzles comes down to my description of China's grand strategy. So what are the grand strategies of rising powers? This is sort of the broad theoretical question that motivates the project. So let me talk a little bit about how rising power grand strategies interact with something that we might call the hegemonic order, or the order that's built by the leading state in the international system. So drawing from the scholar Robert Gilpin, and this was mentioned by Dorothy a moment ago, argue that the international system is hierarchic, which is not a particularly bold claim, but not one we often think a lot about. And that the hegemon's position in regional and global order, being the top state and having a great position in that order, it emerges from three different forms of control that are used to regulate the behavior of subordinate states. You've got coercion, coercive capability that can force compliance. You've got consensual inducements that can incentivize compliance. And you have legitimacy, which allows you to rightfully command others. Orders can vary. You've got some orders like an empire that might stress coercion. Other empires might stress consensual tools. John Eikenberry, a scholar of American order, talks about how it has liberal themes. It's really consent-based. You kind of opt into it and you get something in return. But you could also think of an order that might stress legitimacy. Maybe it doesn't have coercive capability. Maybe it doesn't have the ability to give you a nice economic payoff. What it might provide is legitimacy that you rightfully believe is appropriate. Think of the Caliphate or the Vatican as orders fundamentally organized around the concept of legitimacy. That's very conceptual. These are the key questions that are part of how orders work. And now the question is, how does hegemonic order change over time? Many people talk about orders changing with big wars, right? World War II, for example. But what's under-theorized in many ways is how great powers change order under conditions of peace, not under conditions of war. And the possibility of order transition that's short of war is in many ways extremely urgent right now, since a war between the US and China would be catastrophic. And you can imagine, if you are skeptical that order can transition in peace, you can look at the Soviet Union's collapse as an example of how order transitioned in a time of peace. And rising order powers can take a lot of different strategies towards the hegemon's order. And I assume that these rising powers are a little bit dissatisfied with the order. That's an assumption that I make. But most states are probably dissatisfied with something. And rising powers may want to revise some features of the existing order, especially in their neighborhood. But they face this constraint on doing it. That constraint is the external hegemon. If you're China, that constraint is the United States. And that either independently or through an encircling coalition with the rising power's neighbors could seriously harm the rising power. Think about how the US was wary of European involvement in Latin America. That's a good example that has a corollary, perhaps, with China's anxiety about US alliances in Asia. Now, rising power strategies are basically shaped by a variety of variables. They want to shape the existing order, and their ability to do that is shaped by, first, the perceived threat from the external hegemon, and second, the perceived relative power gap with the external hegemon. And these loosely map onto the external hegemon's ability to harm the rising power and its intention to harm the rising power. Can I hurt you? Do I want to hurt you? Capability and intent. That's basically what you're seeing on this slide. And when you interact them, you sort of get different grand strategies, which I'll walk you through in a moment. But let me take a quick step back. Grand strategy is something that doesn't change easily. It takes time. The scholar David Welch argues, drawing from organization theory and political psychology, that perceptions that we might have, especially on grand strategy, are very sticky. They're hard to change. Oftentimes, organizations are just locked into them, or other times we individually, psychologically, are locked into them. So what does allow our perceptions to change? And oftentimes, I think they change through significant, unexpected, discontinuous events. And so I bifurcate each of these variables into high and low, since minor adjustments will not cause strategic shifts. Only big adjustments cause you to change your thinking. So you get 4 strategies. One is accommodation. The other is blunting. The other is building. The other is dominance or hegemony. In practice, these tend to follow a sequence. When a rising power thinks that the hegemon is just much more powerful than it is, but not particularly threatening, the rising power might just accommodate it. Why not? And China in the 1980s, or India today, you could argue, is sort of accommodationist towards the United States. But then when a rising power thinks that the hegemon is much more powerful, but also very threatening, then it will pursue a different approach, one that we call blunting. And blunting is about targeting the hegemon's forms of control, what I mentioned earlier, the coercion, the consent, the legitimacy, regionally or globally through the weapons of the weak that they may have. And the idea is to avoid triggering backlash from the stronger country here. And that's really China, in my view, from 1989 to 2008. Then, when a rising power thinks that the external hegemon is only modestly more powerful than it, or about the same as it in terms of power, but still very threatening, it pursues what I call a building strategy to construct the foundations for its own order by investing in its own forms of control. That means it can accept the risk of a hegemon opposing it. Now, overt dominance might trigger a balancing coalition, so it won't go all the way there. But when undertaken in its home region successfully, building can allow the rising power to eventually pursue dominance or expansion at the global level. And China at the regional level from 2008 to 2016 was building order in Asia as it became more powerful. And in 2016, I think it moves to global expansion or dominance. So those are the 4 strategies. That's a lot of abstract thinking. Let me now turn, and that's the sequence: accommodation, blunting, building, and dominance. And now I'll turn a bit to China's grand strategy in some detail. So I'm going to now kind of defend the arguments I made at the presentation's outset about what China's grand strategy is and the 3 major phases it has had. And as I mentioned, the very first phase is blunting, because in the 1980s, authoritative Chinese texts were not that critical of the United States. After all, the Soviet Union was the threat, And some Chinese scholars even assumed that the U.S. would ride to the rescue in the case of a war between China and the Soviet Union. But this trifecta of Tiananmen Square, the Gulf War, and the Soviet collapse changed everything. Deng Xiaoping went overnight, and he was the leader essentially of China at the time. He went overnight from praising the United States to condemning it. He said the West was waging war on China without gunsmoke. Let me just get you to that slide. And essentially that it was trying to bring countries like China into its, quote, sphere of influence. He bemoaned the fact, as he put it, that one Cold War had ended and two others had begun, and both were against China. These weren't just temporary Tiananmen-era sentiments. His successor, Jiang Zemin, called the United States China's primary threat in major foreign policy addresses. This is an example of that on the screen. So did his successor, Hu Jintao, and many, many others. Senior leaders thought the same way. Between 1989 and 1992, Deng Xiaoping formulated a strategy to deal with this changing perception of the United States, called Taoguang Yanghui, or what most would call hiding capabilities and biding time in English. And here's a quote on the screen of what he said in 1992 about it. Now, Deng's successors spoke often about this approach in foreign policy speeches, and three elements emerged from it. It was about keeping a low profile and avoiding international leadership, the better to avoid scaring the United States. It was temporary, as Deng Xiaoping says right here on the slide. It was required only because of China's low relative power. Once things had changed, it could pursue a different approach. And it required reducing the external pressure on China's development. So that was the strategy. And it was apparent across multiple instruments of Chinese statecraft. So let me talk about the military side. In the 1980s, China was thinking about power projection, amphibious capabilities, aircraft carriers, landing platform docks, and then all of a sudden it abruptly changes course after the trifecta. Once it becomes clear the U.S. threat is quite serious, and it begins to emphasize different capabilities, asymmetric capabilities, that would frustrate American power projection. What am I talking about, to make it more concrete for everybody in the room? I'm talking about mines, missiles, and submarines. And in my sources, I have speeches from the Central Military Commission that show that this is a conscious prioritization. It's codified in the 1993 military strategic guidelines that are issued by the top military body in China. And all this happened right after the Cold War ended. It didn't happen in the mid and late 90s as tensions over Taiwan began to rise. So that's the military story. There's much more to say here. But the key thing is, if you're building mines and missiles and submarines, you're focused on undermining America's ability to project power. You're not focused on being able to take territory or control water yourself. You can't control something with a sea mine. You have to have an actual vessel, like an aircraft carrier, to really exercise control. So that's the military blunting approach. Then we get institutional blunting. And here the goal was really to join and shape regional institutions. Now, I pulled up some memoirs of Chinese ambassadors involved in this effort, and they're quite explicit about China's need in this time to blunt American power in international institutions in three ways. First, they want to stall the institutions so that they can't become functional, and they don't want the U.S. to use the institutions to claim regional leadership, so they're better to join them to slow them down. There's stuff like the APEC way that China introduces into the organization called APEC to slow it down. Second, they want to use the institutions to constrain American freedom of maneuver. So at the time, they used some of the confidence-building measures in what was called the ASEAN Regional Forum to limit the ability of the United States to exercise in the region. And finally, they wanted to use these institutions to reassure their neighbors. I mentioned at the top, one way the hegemons push back on a rising power is by encircling them with their neighbors. Well, China didn't want that. Joining institutions would send a signal to its neighbors that, hey, I'm willing to talk with you in a multilateral setting and work with you. And that's an underlying motivation for their regional involvements. Finally, China sought on the economic side to continue to benefit from trade with the United States, but it also wanted to reduce the risk of U.S. unilateral trade sanctions. And here the primary goal during blunting was to secure something called most favored nation status. China used what are called APEC negotiations to try to get it in a multilateral body. It didn't work out. They then pushed for most favored nation status in bodies like the GATT and the WTO, and they were successful in the latter case. But what was this fundamentally about? If the U.S. gave China most favored nation status, no longer made it something that was voted on every year, that meant that there was stability in the U.S.-China economic and trade relationship. It meant that China could be assured that America was tying its hands behind its back in the economic space and wouldn't, as it had done after Tiananmen Square, hit it hard with tariffs. Now, that strategy ended up not being super useful 20 years down the road, but at the time it created stability that was unexpected in international trade. That strategy was as good as it was for a while. It continued for almost 2 decades, and it gave way to a new strategy after 2008. That was the global financial crisis. And what you see there is that China's assertiveness really does pick up, not with Xi Jinping, but with Hu Jintao, his predecessor. Even stuff that you've heard of, like the Belt and Road Initiative, begins before Xi Jinping. And that assertiveness is not knee-jerk, it's not random, it is purposeful and strategic, and it is rooted in the shift in their perception of power. So after the global financial crisis, China thought the US was in decline. This is Hu Jintao on the screen. He made some speeches setting new guidelines for foreign policy, and he wanted to note that multipolarity, a euphemism for American decline, was no longer this thing that was proceeding in twists and turns, but it was now, as he called it, irreversible, and the balance of power had fundamentally shifted. This perception of US decline has continued under President Xi. And there's Xi Jinping kind of making the same broad point. Now, China's strategy has long been dependent on its perception of American power. Earlier, I mentioned that the big thing that offers a grand strategy reason for adjustment for rising power is its perception of the power gap between it and the established state, and the perception of the threat between it and the established state. So here, we have a change. Earlier in blunting, we had a change in the perception of threat. Here we have a change in the perception of power. So after the global financial crisis, Hu Jintao gave a speech in 2009 to the 11th Ambassadorial Conference, which put forward what I would call the Hu corollary to the Deng Xiaoping doctrine. And the speech was made public a few years ago, and in it, Hu stresses what he calls actively accomplishing something. Now, this meant actively resolving regional hotspots in the military level. It meant actively setting regional and international rules at the diplomatic level, and it meant actively shaping economic order at the economic level. This appears to be a coordinated grand strategy, one focused on building order within Asia. And under Xi, these objectives have been stressed even further. Xi Jinping, here he is looking quite young. It's an earlier picture. And even when that picture came out, it was too young, I think. But under this young man, these objectives have been stressed further. He's turned actively accomplishing something into fan fa you wei, or striving for achievement. And that's an interesting phrase. It really does mean that the Chinese sort of system had been continuing under him in this direction. And what she also adds to it is the goal of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is a long-standing goal that China has had for, from the very beginning of the rise of the nationalist and communist parties in China. And he also suggests the desire to create what he calls a community of common destiny within Asia, which is sort of a template for what order could look like on Chinese terms within Asia. So what does it mean now, all this stuff at the military, political, and economic levels? Well, on the military side, China shifted from pursuing anti-access area denial capabilities that were intended to blunt the ability of America to exercise its power in the region, and instead begins to finally, at long last, pursue the very amphibious capabilities, power projection capabilities, the aircraft carriers, all the stuff it had put on hold since the end of the Cold War. Now is the time to dust off the plans. We see new plans rolled out in this period for a 4-carrier Navy, for the first ever Chinese Marine Corps, for serial production of what are called landing platform docks, which are useful for taking islands and transporting amphibious forces. We even see plans for overseas basing, which is something I dealt with while working in government. And compared to the mines and the missiles and the submarines of that earlier phase, this will allow China to build an order that constrains its neighbors, that allows it to seize and control islands, and importantly, that provides public security goods. We've now heard that China has offered to guarantee security along the Belt and Road. It's struggling to do that, but that's a sign of order building, and that those order building ambitions are here to stay. So then we get to the political part. And China went essentially from blunting American institutions to now building its own. Again, it's not building order just using the military dimension. It's using these international bodies. It wants to be at the center of Asian institutional architecture. So it went from stalling, again, institutions to sponsoring them, to launching them. And that's explicitly a part of Hu Jintao's 2009 speech. You may have heard of the Asia Infrastructure and Investment Bank, AIIB, launched about a decade ago. That was a part of this plan. This was a kind of liberal order building, the kind the US historically did. And we actually thought that illiberal states like China couldn't do it, but that was just a ridiculous notion. China was offering essentially an economic public good, something that benefited everybody. And then it was giving its neighbors greater say in the institution. It invited them to join the bank. And what did it gain from that? Legitimacy and the prestige of leadership, which are critical parts of building order. There's another institution that China tried to take off. It didn't work. It was called CICA. I won't bother explaining what the acronym is, but it's a confidence-building institution in Asia. And Chinese officials wrote in a series of white papers, they saw 3 paths to creating institutional order in Asia. One was the ASEAN-led path, Southeast Asian countries and their institutions. Another was alliances, which the US had and China was not happy about. And the third were Chinese-led paths. Well, AIB is an example of that, but CICA also is an example of it, because it was an example of something that was essentially pan-Asian, but was not ASEAN-led, and did not include US alliances. So CICA, of the 3 paths, kind of really lends itself to the Chinese path. So China asked to lead the institution under Hu Jintao in 2012. It took over in 2014. It worked to elevate this body that did not have America in it. And she gave a speech there criticizing US alliances, famously arguing that Asia should be for the Asians. The pattern here on the institutional side is that wherever there was an institution led by America, the goal was to join it, slow it down. Wherever it could build its own institution, more power to them. They thought that that was a great way of being able to consolidate order on their terms. And then we get to the economic portion. China has moved from defensive economic statecraft to wielding economic statecraft. And this is both coercive and it's also consensual. On the coercive side, after 2008, China began using economic coercion against its neighbors for the first time in a meaningful way ever. It used it against Japan, the Philippines, Norway, Mongolia, South Korea, and many others, all in a 4-year span after the global financial crisis. So that's coercion. On the consensual side, Chinese influence can work passively. The Belt and Road Initiative, many scholars say, can actually lay the foundation for Chinese-led order. And in fact, many of China's neighbors were growing more and more connected to China through the Belt and Road. They were becoming asymmetrically dependent. That means they're more dependent on China than China's dependent on them. And that offers Beijing leverage and influence. And a big part of this is also elite capture, because these projects allow a way to create order by basically controlling or shaping elites so that they're more in the China space. You give them bribes, you give them payoffs, and they become more favorably inclined towards China. So that's building. We're now in the 3rd phase of Chinese grand strategy. Phase 1 and 2 laid the foundations for a regional strategy, essentially blunting America within Asia and building order within Asia. Phase 3 is about expanding that order globally. And that global phase begins with what you could call the new trifecta: Brexit, the election of President Trump, the West's response to the coronavirus pandemic, etc. And we can kind of deduce this new phase from texts. A new phrase was needed for the period of global expansion, and that phrase in my estimation is the phrase "great changes unseen in a century." So let's just go through the history of these phrases. Earlier we had hiding capabilities and biding time. That was the blunting phrase. Then we had actively accomplished something. That was the building phase. This era needed a phrase. This was the phrase. So where does this phrase come from? Well, it had its roots in a letter written some 250 years ago. In 1872, there was a failed Chinese reformer. He penned this great phrase, quote, "China was experiencing great changes unseen in 3,000 years." And he used it to decry China's humiliation at the hands of imperial powers. The letter is really quite a read. What he's basically saying is we've never seen a situation like this in our long history. Then, in 2017, President Xi repurposes this phrase to say that the world was experiencing great changes unseen in a century. So it rhymes with the past phrase. Now, if you trace the concept through primary sources, as I tried to do, you can tie it to perceptions of American decline. They were basically saying that the language on multipolarity, that language now was the strongest language they'd ever had. The international balance of forces, another metric for measuring American decline, was increasingly balanced. It was the best balance they'd seen in a long time. All of this tied American decline to a positive environment for China, but it noted that there were some risks, because a declining America, like a drowning person, might lash out or pull you down under with them. So the opportunities were enormous, but the risks were great too. And that really does capture China's estimation of the Trump era and what they may be thinking about a second Trump term. So what we see is that Xi's speeches begin to also subtly take swipes at Deng Xiaoping's more restrained legacy in foreign policy, a sign again of the fundamental break now becoming explicit. And the think tank commentary on all of this stuff is very clear. Now, it's not as authoritative as a speech from the government or from the top leader, but the think tankers in China, they're a useful bellwether of where things are going, or they provide useful commentary. So what they say is this: the US is in decline. There is an opportunity now to undertake order building globally. China can surpass the United States in comprehensive national power by 2049. Now, I've heard from colleagues that the Chinese government is also spending more on researching global order than it was spending previously on other issues. In fact, more than all other issues. And back then, a few years ago, when they were in their building phase, the money was going to regional research. Now it's going to global research. So that kind of gives you a sense of where the ambitions are. So this chart here actually shows you that this phrase was basically never used until 2017. There was actually, you can't really see it, but there's a little blip here. Around the time of the global financial crisis, the phrase entered for the very first time into circulation as a way of capturing American decline. But then they thought, actually, this is too optimistic. Let's put it back in the drawer. And then they pulled it out in 2016. They really pulled it out in 2016. You can see it just explodes. And so there's tons and tons of folks writing about it. The white papers are very clear about what it means. But what does it actually mean with respect to their, a few quick quotes here on Xi Jinping. These are the kinds of sentiments that are associated with this idea. The international structure is becoming increasingly balanced. This is an irreversible trend. China will move closer to the center of the world stage. This is all 2017, 1 year, roughly a year after President Trump's election, at the end of that year. At this moment, our diplomatic strategy must keep pace with the times and step out of the stage of hiding capabilities and biding our time. Very clearly a conscious break. With the Deng era, the so-called correct view of our role is not only to calmly analyze various international phenomena. Now remember, Deng Xiaoping had said explicitly, please calmly analyze various international phenomena. He's now saying, don't do that. But put ourselves in the middle of it, which is like what's happening in Ukraine. Put yourself in the middle of international phenomena. More recently, the greatest change of the great changes unseen in a century is China's rise, which fundamentally changes the international balance of power. So you can see that there's really no ambiguity about what this phrase means. A lot of people debate it, but in my view, it's quite clear. And when I talk to my friends in China about it, they used to tell me I was right. Now they say, well, it's complicated. Because they don't want to legitimize the concern that many might have about it. So what does it mean in military, political, and economic terms? Well, in military sense, it means fielding a world-class military with a network of overseas military bases. That is essentially what they are trying to do. In the political arena, it means, as Xi Jinping put it, to, quote, lead in the reform of the global governance system. That is, rewire UN institutions, launch or build out global organizations, expand institutions like the BRICS, which just met a few days ago, expanded meeting of the BRICS, assemble coalitions with authoritarian states on select issues. We see that with Iran, DPRK, and Russia. Engage in soft model export. Help countries like Ecuador or Ethiopia or Tanzania or Botswana basically outfit their governments with surveillance capabilities. In the economic arena, it means to kind of lead the commanding heights of new technology, leave the world more dependent on China than China is on the world, challenge to some degree the role of the US dollar. But fundamentally, it's about winning the next industrial revolution in technology. And a big part of this concept is the idea that the world has gone through 4 industrial revolutions. The first one was steam power. Great Britain rode that all the way to global hegemony. The second was electrification. The third was mass manufacturing. So from Thomas Edison to Ford, you see America lead those industrial revolutions that underwrites American ascent and hegemony. And now we're in the middle of a 4th industrial revolution thanks to the internet, digitization, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, smart manufacturing, and China wants to lead that technologically. So there's a real competition at the technological level for the future. So that is the grand strategy at the global level. It's much more broad than it was at the regional level. It's much more ambitious, and it means that the competition between the US and China no longer just is confined to Asia, but is global, and it spans multiple policy domains. It's 2 countries with, in many cases, conflicting interests, legitimate interests perhaps, but conflicting ones. And there's a lot more to be said about what the policy implications are, about what it was like to work on the Biden administration and all of this. But I wanted to open the lecture with a highly academic-focused discussion of the book and its core arguments so that you'd all be on the same page as me. And now I open it to your questions.
Let me just ask, because we are recording this for streaming, please wait for Kyle to bring you the mic, and please keep your questions concise.
Hi, this is fascinating talk. I just have a quick question about the phase changes we talk about, right? How can we be sure that the phase changes isn't incremental change, but instead is punctuated change that you show, right? Yeah. I can point to several crises in the last decade of 20th century, right, with more incremental changes. For the Inhe incident led to the development of Beidou solar system, right? 1995, 96 Taiwan Strait crisis led to some changes with the way that the CMH, the way they manage conferences, yeah. Right? 1997, Asian financial crisis, the US wasn't there, Beijing was taking the lead, and that does have a confidence building measure started, right? And 1999, embassy bombing, Jiang Zemin stopped saying the military must tolerate and started to rethink about the way which they should finance the PLA. So how can we be sure that those incremental changes weren't there to actually lead to the kind of phase changes you talk about, but instead it's actually a critical juncture type of change? Thank you.
Yeah, so what I focus on really are the Chinese Communist Party's unique role as a coordinating institution within China. So the Chinese Communist Party sits above the state, it penetrates every level of the state, and that creates the ability to coordinate grand strategy. And so when the Chinese Communist Party issues, what it calls strategic guidelines, or 战略方针, that to me is a pretty clear encapsulation of the idea that strategy has changed. So perhaps things pile up incrementally at a low level, but at the higher level of grand strategy, we see the adjustment occur because the party has to communicate that adjustment to everybody else. It has to communicate that adjustment through its texts. And that's why I spent some time walking you through that hierarchy of Chinese texts, because those texts are the way in which the Chinese Communist Party communicates, steers the ship of state. So the three phases I created aren't ones that I created myself. I'm basically telling you what I've read in the texts. The blunting phase was a new strategic guideline issued by Deng Xiaoping in the late 1980s and codified successively, iteratively, by the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee in the early 1990s. And that particular exercise gave rise to one kind of grand strategy, to undermine American power non-assertively, to hide capabilities and bide time. The second major strategic guideline, the only other time we see it revised, is after the global financial crisis, when Hu Jintao puts hiding capabilities and biding time into a, quote, dialectical relationship with his phrase, which is to actively accomplish something. And what he's basically saying, in the way that he describes it, is that these are two sides of a spectrum, and that we're going from one side to the other. So I take them at their word that this is a new strategy. And he also changes in the speech the emphasis on what China is going to do. Just a few years before he gives his 2009 speech about actively accomplishing something, he'd given a 2006 speech, which in many key respects was the opposite. It preached more restraint in the military dimension, for example, with neighbors. But in 2009, he's talking about making more offensive moves. So that is a pretty clear sign of another phase, again, rooted in the texts. And as I showed you, the textual shift is accompanied by a behavioral shift as well. And that's a critical ingredient. Now we have a third phrase, great changes unseen in a century. Now, it is not formally billed as a strategic guideline, but it appears at the top of almost every major Xi speech, or did, for many, many years. That's unusual. And that tells you that something new has happened. It's that chart I had earlier, which showed this massive spike in that phrase, again suggests a new era. So how do I differentiate these three phases? By listening essentially to what the Chinese Communist Party is telling the government, that there are in fact three phases, and by then tracing the behavior for each of those phases to show fundamentally significant shifts. Now, what you've identified is an important question. You can't explain everything. Grand strategy can't explain, for example, why a particular ship captain makes a decision on the water, or why a particular platoon on the China-India border decides to fire a shot or hit someone with a club. They don't actually fire shots on the border. They just use medieval-style combat. It's like a gentleman's agreement between the two sides. So I can't explain those things. That's noise. But strategy is at a much higher level. What I'm trying to explain is the strategic level, which is the major military investments, the major economic plans, the major political investments. That's the undergirding infrastructure of Chinese foreign policy behavior. So you can't explain everything. You explain the things that matter most. Next question. Please, in the back.
Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I'm Caroline Wagner from the Glenn College. The model that you present is very fascinating, and I've enjoyed listening to it. A couple of thoughts, though. One is that it's based on a very kind of national organization of state interests, and sort of a neo-mercantilist approach to understanding economic relationships. China has come into the world since 1980 at a time when we see a shift from a commodity-based economy much more towards an information-based economy. And we know information-based economies operate quite differently economically from commodity-based, even manufacturing-based economies. And they become much more interdependent. And so the technologies and the areas of information that drive the economic growth are not easily separable in or controlled by international organizations. I'm wondering, given your presentation, is China basing their grand strategy on an old model of the ways in which states operate and therefore are making a strategic error?
Well, it's a great question. I think in many ways, China correctly bet that the state would come back in international economic life. And that's clearly the case today. When you see the massive amount of investment needed in high technology, or you see efforts to control the flow of critical technologies, or you see efforts to financially sanction rogue actors, you see that the state is reasserting itself. You're right, international institutions like the WTO are not playing the robust role that many had hoped for them. And that means that the state is playing a bigger role. And sometimes it's not always constrained by the international rules that used to exist. So you are right. The strategy that they had set was only good insofar as the United States continued to adhere to those norms. But they were right for a while. I mean, from the period of 2000 to the period of 2016, the U.S. largely tolerated massive trade deficits with China, which were not entirely a product of U.S.-China interaction, but nonetheless it tolerated them. And it did not ever really threaten economic retaliation in the trade domain for any Chinese behavior that it found unhelpful or contrary to international norms. So there weren't any threats to raise tariffs if China acted the wrong way, whereas in the Cold War, under the Soviet Union, if the Soviet Union did not allow emigration, for example, the U.S. would raise tariffs on the Soviet Union. So the U.S. tied its hands. China made the bet that that would work, and they were right that it worked for a while. It's not working as well anymore because the situation has evolved, and the U.S. has walked away in part from some of the institutions from that era. So basically, I find no fault with your diagnosis. China based its strategy on a moment in international political economy that is now passing, and now it needs a new strategy, and that's in part why it's focused on supply chain dominance and on technology. Supply chain dominance is about making sure the world is more dependent on China than China is on the world, that it's the Amazon of manufacturing. It's the place you go to make anything. And as long as they have that capability, it's not based, by the way, in low wages, but in fact based on capital investment and good infrastructure. As long as they have that ability, then they will always be an important player, and your tariff policy can take a hike because you'll still need China's supply chain. So now the economy, the question of the stickiness of supply chains is profoundly implicated in all of this. Maybe in the back over here, and then we'll work our way around.
Pete Mansour, Senior Fellow at the Mershon Center. Could you go back to your last slide, the transition to the global strategy? I can see the military and economic changes pretty clearly, but I'm wondering if you could flesh out the political changes, because to me it seems like it's an alliance of autocracies with Russia, North Korea, and Iran that isn't very appealing to the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So what are they doing that is appealing to the rest of the world?
It's a good question. Part of the political effort here isn't just about appeal. It's also about influence. And so when you look at China in 2019 or 2018, they had about, Chinese citizens led about 4 or 5 of the 15 or 14 UN special agencies. That was a sign that they were sort of trying to consciously win these votes for who would run, various UN agencies, and they were winning them over time. That's been reversed more recently, but it was an example of an effort to kind of rewire global governance because they'd often use their leadership of those institutions to embed concepts like Xi Jinping thought or the Belt and Road Initiative or certain approaches on Taiwan, right? So that's embedding perspectives in the international system, the architecture of it anyway. Some of it is about setting standards in technical bodies so that things are more conducive to China's economic and technological system. Some of it is about changing the norms around who can participate in the UN so that there's a reduced role for certain NGOs that might be critical, for example, of China. Some of it is about being able to control flows of information. You could argue that more control over social media apps like TikTok the algorithm of which is essentially controlled in Beijing, and which the US can't really review. That gives you the ability to shape information flows. There's a belief, and there's a debate in China about, or there was, about the fact that the US owned sort of the global media infrastructure, CNN. This is an older debate. And they wanted to actually have their own version. You know, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have CNN, but they did eventually have TikTok. That's not incidental. I mean, it may be a private company, but it's consistent with the strategic perspective that China has had about information. So that's all about the politics. That's not about necessarily being the most appealing, but it is about influence. Now, on the question of appeal, they have tried to popularize certain concepts. They have things like the Global Civilization Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Development Initiative, all of which sound innocuous, but also within them contain old ideas that China has generally tried to promote, but now repackaged in something benign that hopefully can rewire the way people think about security and development and civilization. Maybe less emphasis on liberal questions like human rights, more emphasis on pragmatic questions like economic development, for example. On security, less emphasis on perhaps even sovereignty, more emphasis on the security interests of great powers, because the Global Security Initiative is in part inspired by some remarks that Vladimir Putin had given around the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So popularizing all of that stuff, getting countries to sign on is important. And I think a final part of this is creating coalitions to push back. You know, when the United States says, I'm upset about Xinjiang or Hong Kong, as the US did in the past, China was organizing letters, essentially, of different like-minded states, 50, 60, 70, always more than the US, to vouch for its approach. So this is the way that over time, iteratively, these actions individually, collectively, can reshape the norms of the system. So we'll walk down this way. John?
Wouldn't China be better off if it stayed with Deng Xiaoping's hide and bide strategy? Basically, what it's been doing has been wildly counterproductive for the most part. The Belt and Road thing is basically a joke, and the various machinations in the South China Sea and so forth have driven a bunch of very important allies, potential allies, into the hands of the Americans. South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and Australia, for example. So basically, maybe they should spend less time reading American political science and more time just keeping what they were doing so well for a long time, for a long period of time.
Maybe they should listen to you, but they're not. And so I'm not arguing in the book that the strategy is good. I'm arguing that the strategy is real and that it has implications for American interest. It doesn't mean that it doesn't create a sense of overreach sometimes for China. Perhaps they've gone too far. It doesn't mean that it might not have drawbacks. But if it's actually stupid is a question in many ways that's up to the United States, because every downside that you mentioned, John, requires some action by the U.S. to take advantage of it. So let's talk them through one at a time. For the downside on the military alliance question to really manifest, the U.S. has to rally its allies and partners. It has to work with them. Balancing isn't automatic. And the capabilities that they need to be able to deter China are not going to just appear out of thin air. They have to be built, created, sold, transferred. All that's work. It takes time. So the U.S., to take advantage of a misstep, has to act. And that's in many ways what was the difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. The Trump administration told its allies to pay more for defense and hit them with tariffs and sanctions. And the Biden administration actually made a massive commitment to rebuilding those alliances because it knew the only way to compete was together. On the economic side, you're right, they've got a slowdown, and that's a challenge. But it's also the case that industry after industry right now, in part with Chinese state support, is highly competitive internationally. That's a paradox. And it just might be that Xi Jinping knows something that we don't, or maybe he has a different belief system. He might think that the macroeconomic indicators that we all think matter, GDP growth, for example, aren't the ones he's focused on. He might be focused on things like market share. Can I put my rivals out of business? And then once they're out of business and they've forgotten how to make these things, can I be indispensable with my supply chains? Right now, China is 35%, 30 to 35% of global manufacturing. The United States is less than 20. The last time any country had that share of global manufacturing was the United States after the Second World War. So this is a pretty shocking peacetime development. And it has implications because when the United States needs COVID ventilators or masks, or it needs critical minerals or batteries or any number of other goods, there's only one place to get them. And that actually limits your ability to shape them. So yeah, maybe it's a dumb strategy because we assess things in terms of macroeconomics, but they're thinking in terms of politics as well, and power and dependency. Then take technology. It's also the case that this approach might, you could argue, alienate creative intellectuals, the domestic repressive climate. That may be true. But does innovation only come from mavericks? Not necessarily. A lot of innovation can happen incrementally from the manufacturing process. In fact, most innovation might come from that more iterative, gradual process rather than from the guy who invents Google. And so they have this belief that they might lose out a little bit on innovation with their political repression. But if the US innovates, they can scale. If we have an idea, they can make it a product. And they're not wrong about that when you look at electric vehicles or solar panels or a number of other goods. So is it a dumb approach? Maybe. Is it going to succeed? Who knows? But failure of that approach is going to require US action. And that's kind of where I would sort of leave it at the end.
Thank you for the wonderful talk, and also congratulations to well-deserved award.
Oh, thank you.
As I told you, I read your book 2 years ago, and then I look at my notes. Besides the three pillars of concept, capabilities, and execution, I put on my notes, I said, the willpower of the core leader is also critical. So Xi Jinping belonged to the true second generation of the communist founder. And so he believed the communism is ideology built in his blood. Unfortunately, the third generation, the fourth generation, or the fifth generation is decayed, disappeared as ideology. So I think I'd like to ask your comments about my notes to reading your book. And I think the grand strategy is not sustained. Look at the Soviet Union. Both Gorbachev and Yeltsin, they belong to third generation of a communist. And then they decayed. So I'd like to get your comments. Thank you.
It's a great point. The fundamental debate, and I have one view in it, is whether or not Chinese grand strategy or foreign policy is driven by personalities, that is the core leader, or driven by institutions under which the core leader sits. And it's a challenging question to answer. We may never be able to fully disentangle.